When my grandmother died, I knew her house was supposed to pass to me. But my aunt, a greedy and heartless woman, forged the will and sold the house to spend the money on herself. She thought I would accept it. But I took away everything she ever loved. Grandmother was the closest person in my life. After my parents died in a car accident when I was just 7, she took me in without hesitation. While other relatives debated what to do with the orphan child, she simply packed my things and brought me to her modest 2-story home in Maplewood, a quiet suburb outside of Boston. The house wasn't fancy, just an old Victorian with faded blue paint and white trim, surrounded by maple trees that blazed orange and red every fall. But it was home. The creaky wooden floors, the small garden where she taught me to grow tomatoes, the window seat in my bedroom where I'd read for hours, these were the landmarks of my childhood. "This is your home now, Alex," she told me that first night, her hand gentle on my shoulder as I sobbed for my parents. "And it always will be." As I grew up, I watched her pour everything into that house and into me. She worked as a nurse until she was 70, taking extra shifts to pay for my college applications. When I got accepted to Boston University, she cried with joy, though I know she worried about the loans we'd need. "Education is something no one can take from you," she said, signing the paperwork. "Your grandfather and I bought this house so we'd always have a place that was ours. When I'm gone, it'll be yours, something no one can take from you either." I visited her every weekend during college. Those years were tough, working part-time, studying late, living in a cramped dorm, but knowing I had her home to return to kept me going. By my senior year, her health began to fail. Arthritis gnarled her once nimble nurse's hands, and her breathing grew labored from the early stages of congestive heart failure. 2 months before my graduation, she called me over for tea. We sat at her worn kitchen table, the spring sunlight streaming through sheer curtains she'd sewn decades ago. "I've updated my will," she said matter-of-factly, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Everything goes to you, the house, what little savings I have. Keep this copy safe. I've filed the original with Mr. Hargrove downtown." I tried to protest, to change the subject, but she fixed me with those clear blue eyes that had always seen right through me. "We all die, Alex. I'm at peace with it. Just promise me you'll fill this house with life when I'm gone." I promised, tucking the envelope away, trying to ignore the coldness in my stomach. What I didn't know was that my Aunt Carol had been listening from the hallway. Carol was my mother's older sister. Growing up, she'd visit 3 or 4 times a year, always with expensive gifts and stories about her glamorous life in Manhattan. She'd married young to a wealthy investment banker, divorced him for an even wealthier real estate developer, then divorced him too. She never had children, never seemed to work, and always managed to look 10 years younger than her actual age. "Such a waste," I once heard grandmother mutter after one of Carol's visits. "All that money and not a shred of substance." Carol started visiting more often as grandmother's health declined. She'd bring fancy groceries and designer nightgowns, insisting on helping organize medications or clean out closets. Grandmother tolerated these visits with strained politeness. "Your aunt means well," she'd say after Carol left, though her tone suggested otherwise. I graduated that May, and grandmother beamed with pride from the audience, Carol surprisingly at her side. 3 days later, grandmother had a massive stroke. The doctors said it was quick, that she likely felt little pain. Carol arrived at the hospital before I did, already speaking with administrators, already calling herself the next of kin. The funeral was small, just as grandmother would have wanted. Carol wore designer black, her grief performative and loud. I sat quietly in the front row, a hollowness inside me that no words could fill. Afterward, Carol insisted I stay at her hotel rather than return to the empty house. "We need to talk about arrangements," she said, her arm around my shoulders as she guided me to her rented Mercedes. In her hotel suite, over room service I couldn't taste, Carol outlined her version of reality. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly these past few years," she said, picking at a salad. The dementia was starting, though she hid it well. I looked up sharply. Dementia? She didn't have dementia. Carol's smile tightened. The doctors saw the signs, Alex. Why do you think I started visiting more? I was concerned. What doctors? Her physician never mentioned. The point is, she interrupted, the will she made years ago is the valid one. I've already spoken with the family attorney. My stomach dropped. Family attorney? Grandmother used Mr. Hargrove downtown. Carol waved a manicured hand. Mr. Hargrove retired last year. The firm was bought by Daniels and Weber. They've reviewed everything. She reached into her purse and pulled out an official-looking document. As her only living child, I inherit the house and her assets. It's all very standard. I stared at the paper, the words swimming before my eyes. That's not possible. She gave me a copy of her will just a few months ago. Carol's expression hardened for just a moment before smoothing into concern. Oh, Alex. That's exactly what I mean about her confusion. Whatever she gave you wasn't legal. I'm sorry. I didn't sleep that night. At dawn, I drove to grandmother's house, my house, and let myself in with the key I'd had since high school. I went straight to the small study off the living room and began searching through her neat files. Birth certificates, tax returns, insurance policies, all organized with a nurse's precision. But no will. I searched for hours, growing increasingly frantic. The filing cabinet, the desk drawers, the small safe behind the painting of Cape Cod, nothing. Even the envelope she'd given me, which I'd stored in my old bedroom dresser, was gone. When Carol arrived around noon, I confronted her immediately. What have you done with her will? The real one? Carol's expression was a perfect blend of pity and concern. Alex, you're grieving. We all are. But these accusations aren't healthy. I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. Grandmother left me the house. She told me so explicitly. Verbal promises aren't legally binding, Carol said, her voice hardening. The legal will is what matters, and I have it. She sighed dramatically. Look, I know this is hard. I'm not unreasonable. You can stay here for a month while you find an apartment. I'll even help with the security deposit. I felt my hands shaking with rage but kept my voice steady. I don't want your charity. I want what grandmother intended for me to have. Carol's smile didn't reach her eyes. Well, that's not up to you, is it? I left before I could say something I'd regret. I drove straight to Hargrove, Daniels and Weber, the law firm Carol had mentioned. The receptionist confirmed that Mr. Hargrove had indeed retired the previous year, but his files had been transferred to the new partners. I asked to speak with whoever had handled my grandmother's estate. After a 30-minute wait, a young associate named Lisa Chin invited me into her office. I understand you have questions about Margaret Thompson's will, she said, opening a folder. Yes. My grandmother made a new will just months ago. She left everything to me. Lisa frowned, checking her documents. I'm sorry, but the most recent will we have is from 2011, leaving all assets to her daughter, Carol Bennett. That's impossible. She updated it this year. She told me she filed it with Mr. Hargrove. Lisa typed something into her computer. Mr. Hargrove's files were all digitized when the firm changed hands. There's nothing more recent than 2011. She gave me a sympathetic look. Sometimes people intend to update their wills but don't complete the process. But I knew my grandmother. She didn't leave things undone. I spent the next week in a daze, alternating between grief and fury. I stayed with a college friend, unable to bear being in grandmother's house with Carol sorting through belongings, deciding what to keep and what to discard. On Saturday morning, I received a text from Carol, meeting with realtor today. Property needs clearing by end of month. I nearly threw my phone across the room. Instead, I drove to Mr. Hargrove's home address, which I'd managed to find online. He was in his mid-70s now, enjoying retirement in a small bungalow not far from his old office. When I explained who I was, his face lit with recognition. Margaret Thompson's grandson. Come in, come in. Over coffee, I explained the situation. His bushy eyebrows drew together as he listened. That doesn't sound right at all, he said when I finished. Your grandmother was very clear about her wishes. We completed the new will in February. I filed it myself before the firm changed hands. My heart raced. So there is a new will? Absolutely. She left everything to you, with a small allowance for her church. Carol wasn't mentioned at all. He shook his head. Margaret was quite explicit about that. But the new firm says they only have the 2011 will. Mr. Hargrove's expression darkened. That's very concerning. The transition was somewhat chaotic, I'll admit. But all files should have transferred. He thought for a moment. I kept backup copies of important documents. Let me check my home office. He returned 15 minutes later, holding a manila envelope. Here we are. Executed February 18th of this year. Your grandmother was of completely sound mind, I made certain of that, given her age. Inside was exactly what I'd been searching for, grandmother's will, leaving the house and all assets to me, Alexander James Thompson. This is a copy, Mr. Hargrove explained. Not legally binding on its own, but proof that the original exists, or existed. We'll need to find out what happened to it. Armed with this evidence, I returned to the law firm on Monday morning, this time requesting to speak with a senior partner. When presented with the copy and Mr. Hargrove's signed statement, the partner, Mr. Weber, grew visibly uncomfortable. This is highly irregular, he said. We'll conduct a thorough investigation immediately. 2 days later, I received a call. Mr. Thompson, we've discovered some inconsistencies in how your grandmother's files were processed. It appears the most recent will was misfiled during the digital transition. My relief was short-lived. However, he continued, we've just been informed by Ms. Bennett that the property has already been sold. The closing was yesterday. I felt the floor drop out from under me. That's not possible. You can't sell property that quickly. Apparently, Ms. Bennett had a cash buyer ready. The sale was expedited. I hung up and immediately called Carol. It went to voicemail. I drove to grandmother's house and found a "sold" sign in the yard and a strange car in the driveway. A middle-aged man in khakis was measuring the porch. Excuse me, I said, approaching him. What's going on here? He looked up, smiling. Just planning some renovations. We closed on the house yesterday. I'm Alex Thompson. This house belonged to my grandmother. His smile faltered. Oh, we purchased it from a Carol Bennett. The sale's complete, all legal and above board. I managed to keep my voice level. You might want to hold off on those renovations. There's a legal issue with the sale. Back in my car, I called Mr. Weber again. He confirmed my worst fears, Carol had somehow pushed the sale through before the will issue could be resolved. While I might eventually win in court, the process would be lengthy and expensive. I sat in my car, staring at the house I'd grown up in, now lost to me through Carol's deception. Something hardened inside me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. My investigation began with finding out where Carol was staying. She'd checked out of her hotel, but through social media, I discovered she was renting a luxury condo downtown while overseeing family matters. I also learned she'd booked a 3-week European cruise departing in a month, no doubt funded by my inheritance. Next, I researched Carol's finances. As grandmother's executor, even under the fraudulent will, she had to file public documents. I discovered she'd sold the house for $720,000, well below market value of nearly $900,000, but it was a cash sale, which explained the speed. What I found next made my blood boil. Carol had significant debts, credit cards, a second mortgage on her Manhattan apartment, and a personal loan with unfavorable terms. She'd been living far beyond her means for years, maintaining the illusion of wealth while sinking deeper into debt. I expanded my search, discovering that Carol had a pattern of questionable financial dealings. Her second divorce hadn't been as profitable as she'd claimed. In fact, she'd signed a prenuptial agreement that limited her settlement. Her lavish lifestyle was funded primarily through debt and occasional loans from friends that were never repaid. Armed with this knowledge, I formulated a plan. First, I contacted Mr. Douglas, the buyer of grandmother's house, and explained the situation fully, showing him the copy of the real will and the law firm's admission of mishandling. To my surprise, he was sympathetic. "My mother went through something similar," he said. "I had no idea when I purchased the property." He agreed to cooperate with any legal action and put his renovation plans on hold. Next, I hired a forensic accountant who specialized in fraud cases. She confirmed what I suspected: Carol had likely forged documents and potentially committed tax fraud by not reporting some income. These were serious charges that could result in significant penalties. Then I made my most important move. Through social media, I located Carol's second ex-husband, Richard Klein, now living in Chicago. I found his business email and sent a message explaining who I was and asking for a brief conversation about Carol. He responded within hours: "I've been waiting for someone to finally see through Carol's facade. Call me." Our phone conversation was revealing. Richard had suspected Carol of financial impropriety during their marriage but couldn't prove it. After their divorce, he discovered she'd hidden assets and taken out loans in his name. He'd been building a case against her for years but struggled to find sufficient evidence. "She's meticulous about covering her tracks," Richard explained. "But if what you're saying is true about the will, that might be the mistake we've been waiting for." Together, we pooled our resources. Richard had connections in financial investigation, and I had the evidence of the forged will. We filed formal complaints with the State Bar Association against Carol's lawyer, who had suspiciously expedited the house sale. We submitted evidence to the district attorney's office suggesting multiple instances of fraud. Most crucially, Richard revealed that Carol had defaulted on agreements from their divorce settlement. According to their terms, if she missed payments on certain shared investments, ownership would revert to him. She'd stopped paying years ago, assuming he wouldn't notice or bother to enforce the clause. Those investments include partial ownership of her Manhattan apartment, Richard said with satisfaction. "She doesn't own it outright like she claims." While all this was in motion, I kept a low profile. Carol tried to contact me once, offering a small gift from the house sale to remember your grandmother by. I declined politely, giving no indication of what was coming. 3 weeks after grandmother's house was sold, everything fell into place. The Bar Association opened an investigation into Carol's lawyer. The DA's office took interest in the forged will case. Richard filed for enforcement of the divorce agreement terms, putting a lien on Carol's apartment. But the masterstroke came from an unexpected source. Mr. Hargrove, outraged at how his former firm had handled his client's will, reached out to colleagues in the legal community. One of them remembered notarizing grandmother's will in February. More importantly, they had kept their own record of the document, standard procedure for their office. This was the smoking gun. With an official record of the notarized will, we had proof that the document had existed and had been legally executed. The law firm that had misfiled it now faced serious questions about their handling of the case. Carol was on a shopping spree in Manhattan when it all came crashing down. The DA's office froze her bank accounts pending investigation. Richard's enforcement action prevented her from accessing her apartment. The Bar Association's investigation meant her lawyer couldn't continue representing her. When she called me, Her voice was no longer smooth and controlled. "What have you done?" she demanded. "Nothing," I replied calmly. "I'm just seeking justice for grandmother." "This is ridiculous. You have no proof of anything." "Actually, we found the notary's record of grandmother's will. The one leaving everything to me. The one you somehow made disappear." There was a long silence. "I don't know what you're talking about," she finally said, but her voice wavered. "The house sale is being invalidated," I continued. "The firm admitted to improper handling of grandmother's will. And there are some interesting questions about your finances that the authorities would like answered." "You can't do this to me." Her voice rose to a shriek. "I need that money. I have debts, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly. You stole from my grandmother. You stole from me. And now you're facing the consequences." The legal proceedings took months. Carol hired and fired 3 different lawyers, each time claiming they weren't representing her interests adequately. In reality, no competent attorney could defend the indefensible. Mr. Douglas, the house buyer, was fully refunded. The property reverted to grandmother's estate, which, under the legitimate will, passed to me. Richard's enforcement action resulted in the discovery that Carol had committed perjury during their divorce proceedings, hiding assets that should have been divided. By the time the dust settled, Carol had lost everything. Her apartment was seized to satisfy creditors. Her bank accounts were emptied to repay debts and legal penalties. Her reputation in her social circles was destroyed as the story of her fraud became public. She showed up at my door, grandmother's door, 6 months after it all began. Gone were the designer clothes and perfect makeup. She looked every one of her 58 years, perhaps more. "Please, Alex," she said, her voice breaking. "I have nowhere to go. No money. Nothing." I looked at her, this woman who had tried to steal my inheritance, who had disrespected my grandmother's wishes, who had nearly taken the only real home I'd ever known. "You did this to yourself," I said quietly. "Every choice, every lie, every manipulation, that was all you." "But we're family," she pleaded. "Grandmother was my family," I replied. "She taught me about integrity, about hard work, about honesty. Values you clearly never shared." I closed the door gently but firmly, leaving her on the porch where grandmother had once rocked and watched the sunset. I felt no satisfaction, no pleasure in her downfall, only a hollow sense that justice, cold as it might be, had been served. Inside, I ran my hand along the familiar banister of the staircase. The house felt different now, shadowed by what had happened, but still home. In the coming months, I would honor my promise to fill it with life again. As for Carol, I heard she moved to Arizona to live with a distant cousin. Sometimes I wonder if she learned anything from losing everything. I doubt it. People like Carol rarely change, they just find new targets, new schemes. But they won't find them here. This house is protected now, just as grandmother wanted. A place that belongs to me, something no one can take away.